Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Graham Hall. I'm the administrative consultant on this project, and today I'm filling in uh, on the presentation for our principal investigator and lead researcher, Dr. Lia Ruttan. Um, our project is a three-phase project and currently wrapping up phase one, and it focuses on indigenous populations and their history in forest firefighting and fire management programs, and explores some of the traditional knowledge and methods used and why those are important and useful in modern forest fighting programs and practices today. This research is also accompanied by an academic research article that goes into more of the results-based material we uncovered in our phase one qualitative research. So if this topic interests any of you today, or you just like a little more information, we'll leave our contact information at the end so that you can reach out. So our research is primarily focused within the Slave Mackenzie River system up here in Canada. It's quite large and occupies most of the northern Canadian territories, specifically the Northwest Territories. And within this region, it is populated most prominently by Indigenous communities, Dene, Metis, and Cree. It's also a heavily forested area, particularly below the tree line, which is mostly made up of boreal forest. And the communities that are included within our research, including the primary community of Fort Smith, are covered by Treaty 8 and Treaty Land Entitlement. So before we dig into the meat and bones of the presentation, we think it would be helpful just to share a bit of background on some of the Indigenous perspectives around fire and around the land we are looking to protect in our fire management programs. From an Indigenous perspective, they see the land as a shared environment, and what they mean by that is the land is shared with other people and cultures, just like you and I, as well as animals, plants, and their ancestors who played and worked to preserve the land and give the cultural significance that many Indigenous people celebrate and enjoy today. It's also important to recognize the prevalence of fire in Indigenous lives, particularly within these northern communities. Fire plays a lot of different roles, probably most significantly in ceremonial practices, as you see a drum circle there on the left, but also in preparing much of the food these communities might take in. On the right, you have a picture actually of one of the elders we interviewed who's used fire to dry their meat. They also dry fish, and fire is also important in teaching practical skills and traditional knowledge with younger Indigenous populations as that information is passed down through the generations. And I also wanted to share a quick quote from one of the elders as well that was part of our phase one interviews. And this quote just quickly talks about maybe some of the differences of how Indigenous peoples and communities see the land they occupy today, and how that might be different from the ways some of the Western cultures may have viewed it in the past. So this is from Raymond Beaver. My father taught us that you must keep everything in mind, not just the tree, but also above, beyond, and below, the animals, the birds, the watershed, and everything. They are also all part of the tree. You can't cut the tree without impacting all the birds, the squirrels, and the plants. Usually, forestry wants to cut trees for lumber or wood. They see it as only a few trees rather than all the things that will be affected. When my father wanted birch for snowshoes before cutting a tree, he thought of all the other things that might be affected before choosing a tree. And just to expand on this perspective, I think it'd be useful for everyone to see a quick 2-minute piece of some of the video interviews we conducted that comes from this elder's daughter, actually, and how it affects their family and community today. So I'll show you that now.
Hi, I'm Julie Beaver, daughter of Raymond Beaver. We live in Fort Smith, Northwest Territories. We are Salt River First Nation members. I remember my first 5 years were spent out on the land, out on my dad's trap line. My father, an active hunter, trapper, and firefighter in those days, dedicated the majority of his time to being out on the land in various situations. I think my dad's wisdom exceeds with him his ancestral line, being very mindful when out on the land in all weather conditions. Asking elders questions about why and how certain weather systems affect Mother Nature were key elements to him as a crew boss. So unfortunately, because of a colonizational mindset, I think a time came where traditional knowledge was no longer credible. And I think it's time to embrace the knowledge of the experts, the elders, who were a huge part of being out on the land and knowing the environment, the animals, the way they lived in all weather conditions. Nature has a way of creating patterns, and so I think once aware of those patterns, man can learn from them. And so in this case, with my father and firefighting, he spent a lot of time hunting, trapping. He now has the ability to hear about a fire situation and give you pointers on, how to put it out. He doesn't need to be there. I believe that man can learn from situations, but it's also very important that you step in and you take the lead on putting fires out, especially in traditional hunting grounds. I think it's really important. I know my dad was acutely aware of when fires should be left to burn and when they should be actively worked because of certain areas. Allowing for a regrowth of areas was also really important. Today, my father is not actively firefighting, but he continues to share his stories, and his grandson has recently taken a job in firefighting. So I'm sure that there's going to be a lot of stories shared and a lot of questions asked.
So the 2014 fire season was really the watershed moment for a lot of this research to kick off. In terms of hectares burned, it was one of the most devastating fire seasons in Canadian history, especially recent history. And it got a lot of the communities talking about the differences in Indigenous perspectives versus modern Western perspectives in how to approach and fight fire. So after this season, many of the Indigenous elders in these communities contacted our principal investigator, who's well known throughout the region, Dr. Ruttan. Many of these elders were former parks and territorial fire crew leaders, and proud of their skills and protective of their communities, they wished to share their experience and perspectives, and especially traditional land knowledge, in order to assist younger firefighters and relatives working in boreal forest communities to protect this land in light of what happened during 2014. And this dynamic between the differences in Indigenous perspectives and Western perspectives on how to approach fire can really be seen all over the world, not just here in Canada. Most recently, in the Australian fires just prior to the pandemic, actually. And again, the contrast here lies heavily in how Indigenous people view the land um, under that term we described as shared environment earlier versus non-Indigenous populations and their view and how they use the land. And really, this indoctrinates a lot of the colonized underminings Indigenous people feel, along with racism and exclusion, in managing fire and the strategy and response employed. So, in turning it back to our own slave Mackenzie river system here in Canada, there's a lot of research out there on fighting fires in boreal forested regions, but very little research available on the social history and localized firefighting strategies and experience that can be used to refine these broad approaches. There's also a large contrast in how modern fire management programs here in Canada see northern and valued resources. Typically, these programs might identify northern valued resources such as mining, extraction points, and forestry sites, and often that's quite different in how Indigenous populations within the region view and use the land. Ultimately, all of this signals that a more community-based research is needed here, and this is essentially what Indigenous elders in these communities have been insistent on. So in looking at the objectives for our research, phase one is really all about starting to record and preserve their traditional knowledges within these elders who have been firefighters in the past and have different knowledge of the land and its use. And as we take in that research, to share the data, strategies, and tactics with various stakeholders. And we'll talk a little bit more about what we plan on doing there in phase 2 and 3 a little bit later in the presentation. So over the last handful of decades, Indigenous people have seen their roles significantly reduced within firefighting programs in Canada. Until recently, fire crews, particularly in our own slave Mackenzie region, were almost entirely made up of Indigenous people, and so they would occupy all manner of position, anything from a line worker to a crew and fire boss, actually organizing the men. And as it does with most people in the Indigenous population who occupied these positions, this was seasonal income. And so during the winter months, most of these Indigenous men would be trapping and hunting in the same area throughout the winter, which provided them with a wealth of knowledge on the land and skills to use on the fire when the summer season came again, to the extent that tools and technology, even such as a rudimentary compass, were often not used. And to the same extent, during the fire season, even when emergency firefighters were needed, they would often pick up men from these northern communities because of their intimate knowledge of the land. Indigenous firefighting crews also use their own leadership styles, where each member intimately knew their role and each other's skills, and leaders and line workers respected and didn't have to itemize or prioritize instructions or ask for frequent reporting back. So when comparing this history to modern firefighting programs in Canada, the difference in perspective can be outlined quite clearly. During our phase 1 interviews with Indigenous elders formerly leading these same fire programs, they pointed to a number of things. Firstly, a broadening reliance on technology and education in these programs, and a diminishing use of land knowledge and crew experience when fighting fire. Interviewed elders also felt there is a reluctance in the programs now to admit mistakes or appropriately inform and consult with the community. This serves to erode the trust and overlook important Indigenous resources and priorities, as we talked about earlier. Um, Furthermore, national and regional policies in Canada have seen a predominant shift in fire approach, now choosing to monitor many of the fires they may have fought before, and many of which these elders feel strongly that they should be fought. Just to hit the point home a little further, I want to briefly direct your attention to the quote we have here on the right, which I think does a good job at highlighting the impact some of these differences in decision making around fire can have on these northern communities. In this particular example, an Indigenous family's cabin was at risk of fire. The cabin was ultimately deemed a valued resource that should be protected, but the land around it was not. And while the implications of that may have not been apparent to the people leading the fire program at the time, through this quote, you can feel the impact that it has on this family and these communities in these cases. Even if I just read a part of the excerpt, now the kids hear us talking about all the fun we had and about the cabin, and they want to go too. They want to learn to snare rabbits, but they can't do that. There's nothing but charcoal all around. And during this research, there's a number of theoretical implications over the longer 3 phase of this project that we can take in and will ultimately be helpful. We've listed some of them here in case you're curious, but these essentially help us broaden the perspective by stressing some of the social ecological resilience between Indigenous people and people native to various lands and the environment themselves. So earlier in the presentation, we talked about the objectives of the research. Primarily, as stated before, it's the preservation of a diminishing knowledge base, particularly with some of these very older elders who are on their last legs, who are around, in the business of fire for quite a while. So there's some hurry there to get that done. But beyond the preservation, there's a lot of knowledge we believe can be shared and integrated in today's programs today, and we plan on doing that by eventually creating a manual of regional techniques and tactics for the Slave Mackenzie River system. And we hope the research will eventually open a greater dialogue and bring attention to the national and territorial governments on these issues with Indigenous populations, as well as develop links with other Indigenous communities and researchers on these issues, and potentially explore co-management and consulting opportunities for Indigenous leaders in these communities. And to end the presentation today here, we thought it might be nice to have one of our elders we interviewed do it for us. So we'll show you a bit of the excerpt we did with him. His name is Raymond Beaver and was one of the principal participants in our Phase 1 research.
Raymond Beaver. I'm from Fort Smith. I was born there, and I'm 75 years old. And well, actually, the first time I went in the bush was my dad was in 12 years old, and then later on I quit school and started trapping with my dad. And when I was 15, and that's what I did most of this winter and the summertime, because it included being out in the bush. So I started fighting fire. So that was one of the things that I liked, because of I could be in a bush in the summertime, also be in a bush in the wintertime. So that's how I got started in firefighting, and because I liked the lifestyle. At that time in 63, 64 was all native people, except for that one fire we had a policeman on the, you were looking after, of course they had prisoners out fighting fire, so they had 5 prisoners and a policeman, so he was the only non-native that was on the fire line. Most of those people, like I was saying, in the early 60s were all trappers, hunters. They all had the same values, basically. Only later that the value became, okay, money rather than protection of the land. So their interest was in saving the land. It was basically what it was all about, save the land. People were out there trapping. So you're there, hopefully you're going to try to get that fire before it gets too big so that you're helping somebody. And that's the way it was. I mean, it's not like, oh, well, it's just another tree that's burning. Which is, to me, kind of a attitude a lot of people have when there's not where they live, kind of thing. I guess at that time especially, is that the connection between native people and animals. If there's no animals, there's no native people, basically, is the way the thinking went. So, to protect those is what it was all about. Not to protect corporate land, or stuff like that. It was, you want to help put that fire out. And so my intention, of course, was always going to the fire was put it out. It's not all about how it went later on. Is you hear people talking. They see a thundercloud coming. Oh, overtime cloud. For me, it was never overtime cloud. It was, I hope it doesn't start a fire. And when it went to a fire is put it out, not keep it going because you're going to make more overtime. Well, the traditional knowledge, I believe, helped in how to fight fire, is especially with when the people are talking about, like long ago, people used to talk about how they burnt around the communities to prevent fire from burning their communities, all that stuff. And they burned it at a certain time. So some of that understanding of the way they did it helped me, because now when I'm going to do either burnout or backfire, well, those things come into mind. Like, okay, this is how they did it. This is how they didn't do it. Like all those kind of things. So after the other thing, of course, is you understand, the wind, how it would go. Like, see, even though it looks like it's blowing this way, well, it all depends on how the trees are. Well, blowing this way, but if the trees are kind of in a curve, well, the wind's going this way. It's not going straight. So you get to know those things because of hunting. You learn all those things, and so you know now if you're going to backfire or burn out, okay, you look at the country and say, okay, this is how we could do it here. All those things are part of traditional knowledge. It's not something you're going to learn from any the universities over there, I'm sure. The thing is, the fire's coming and it's drawing oxygen towards the south. So you light the fire at the right time, it'll go that way. You light it too early, though, the wind is still coming this way, right? So it goes that way. I smoked that time. Anyway, he was telling Lia, he seemed to know exactly when to light the fire. Just like it was part of, just like it was the draw of a cigarette, which is partly true, because now the smoke would be going this way instead of this way because of the wind, right? So it's something that you learn over time. I mean, the elders are telling you something, you're listening. And that was the other thing about Aboriginal people. All people that, like, say, my age, somebody tells you something, doesn't have to be a really old person, is adult, he has some experience, you're listening to him. You're listening to what he says. most of the time it was an elder that was the boss too, because the people that were working at forestry recognized the experience of these elders. So they put him as a boss, which changed later on to say, oh yeah, well, in 1973, 74 is they brought a new superintendent. Like they didn't have the fire center yet, but anyway, brought this guy in and he brought us to his office and he made a chart and said, oh, you guys are here with your experience, and you had a line pretty well straight. But he said, university students, they come in, they're here. He said, within 2 years, they'll know more than you guys. I said, bullshit. And like I said, that's when the forestry went downhill from that time. The non-native people that actually the bosses have to realize they don't know as much as us elders that actually fought fire in those times. Hopefully in the future there'll be somebody that will think this is a good thing, that they will use that. Because if you learn the way that we fought fire long ago, you would be the best firefighting crews in the world. You got to do it that way. And then you could add the helicopters, bombers, and stuff. That would make you more efficient.
So thanks everyone for sitting in with us today from your homes. We don't have time for any questions today. We pushed it a little long. But if you do have any questions or just want a little more information on the research we're conducting, I've listed my email as well. Again, is our principal researcher, Dr. Lia Ruttan's email as well. Feel free to shoot an email to either of us, and we'd love to hear from you. Thanks again, everyone.